Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today, we have another migration and habitat report for you, and this is somewhat of a bonus episode because we will be speaking simultaneously with the state waterfowl biologist from two states, specifically out in the Pacific Northwest, the states of Washington and Oregon. So with that, let me welcome in those two guests. First, Kyle Spriggans, the Waterfowl Section Manager for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Kyle, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
And Brandon Reiches, the Migratory Game Bird Coordinator for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Brandon, same to you. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You guys are joining us here today, just sort of in full disclosure for our listeners, because we're going to also talk with you about another issue that will be a more extended discussion, specifically related to harvest management of geese in the Pacific Northwest and some of the unique things that have to go into place to enable responsible harvest of goose populations. But I thought as long as we had you on the phone here, it would be useful and perhaps informative to our waterfowl hunters and constituents out west to get a report from each of you, sort of from the field, what we're hearing with regard to waterfowl migration, habitat conditions, any type of weather developments, lack of weather, whatever the case may be. But I just wanted to take advantage of this opportunity. And again, as I try to do with these sort of bonus episodes, is let our listeners know when we are recording them. And today we are recording on December 22nd, so just a few days before Christmas. Hopefully this will be out sometime during the Christmas week. So with that, Kyle, I'll start with you, just because you're in a state that's a bit farther north. What can you tell our listeners about what you know with regard to habitat conditions, waterfowl abundances, and so forth? Just give us an update there.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So it's important to realize that Washington had sort of two faces, the west of the Cascade and east of the Cascade. And the reason that's important is west side of the state is highly influenced by birds coming down from Alaska. East side of the state is highly influenced by birds coming out of the prairies in Alberta and some of the inland portions of BC. So when you're watching weather to the north, you're kind of keeping eyes on both areas depending on where you are in the state. For Washington, we had a fairly early pulse. Everything kind of lined up for the beginning of the season really well, from temperatures and precip and everything that you would kind of be hoping would come together for an opening weekend. But more recently, it's stalled out. We are definitely in sort of the stalled out phase of birds have been here for a while, and they are not really being pressured by temperatures to move around and find food. Some of the indicators of has the northerns come down. What we tend to watch is, are the swans in the area, and do some of our species that we would expect to push that sort of northern limit, have they really arrived in numbers? And specifically the swans and the snow geese are the ones that you kind of keep an eye on. And both of those are here in the state, so in strong numbers already. So it's one of those, there might be some birds hiding to the north, but the reality is temperatures and everything else certainly seem to indicate that they're here. They're just not being, they're not feeling the pressure to move around and find the food in different areas just yet.
That's not unlike what we're hearing, Kyle, from some of the states here east of the Rockies. We speak with a lot of our state biologist partners here, I guess more locally, the southern end of the Mississippi Flyway. A lot of those agencies actually conduct aerial surveys or ground surveys of some sorts on a monthly basis, or in some cases even more frequently than that. Do you in Washington conduct any type of surveys during the winter months, either ground-based or aerial?
It's fairly limited, much less so than it used to be. The main surveys that we conduct are related to snow geese, brant, and the swans. Not that they're harvestable, but in terms of keeping track of waterfowl populations, those are the three that we do have winter flights that inform sort of what is the population at. We have on the west side of the state, west of the Cascades, we have a winter survey For snow geese, that spans the British Columbia side, the Fraser River Delta, and then our side, the Skagit River Delta, two big agricultural open river floodplain areas that are sort of classic winter areas. Those snow geese are related to the ones that are coming down from Rainbow Island, Russia. And so we have sort of a heightened monitoring protocol around those. And then on the east side of the state, with major effort from Brandon's side, we conduct sort of a synchronized fly-off count just to kind of get idea of how many snow geese are in that area. The only other survey that we conduct is we have a pretty limited brant harvest opportunity. Brant is a sea goose, very popular in some of the coastal areas of Washington. We have 4 counties that we allow that limited opportunity, and one of those is actually triggered by an annual winter count. So we're gearing up right now to pull off that flight.
When do you conduct your snow goose surveys?
Typically in earlier part of December. Part of that for us is on the west side, we have some closure periods. And so we try to take advantage of the birds not being mixed up and pushed around by harvest pressure. And so we try to get a better count on those. Typically in that sort of earlier December period.
And you don't have any reports on that survey off the cuff right now, do you? I realize I might be catching you off guard with this.
We're processing it right now. It's over 100,000 birds. I know that, but sort of the exact number, we're still honing in on what that looks like.
Okay, good. And let's talk about hunting, any type of reports on hunting success. And I do realize that you guys as a state waterfowl biologist probably hate these questions more than anyone else. You want to know when people ask you, how's the hunting going? Because it's always so variable. I get that. We have to provide that caveat up front. But from if someone calls you and says, hey, are you hearing better reports out of the eastern part of the state, out of the western part of the state? Are there any particular subregions that you have heard more favorable than disfavorable reports from this year?
The general descriptions that we've been hearing are that the duck hunting in particular has kind of stalled out, like I was mentioning. There is certainly some goose opportunity that in different parts of the state. In the east side of the state, it's much more oriented towards Canada goose harvest. On the west side, up in that Skagit sort of northwest corner of the state, as I mentioned, we had a closed period on the snow geese, so we just had sort of a second period opener that definitely registered some harvest potential there. And then from the ducks, typically the west side, when it's in this sort of stall out period, the west side, because we have a lot of coastal tidal areas, there are patches of opportunity out there if you can find it, because birds are moving with the tide rather than sort of the freshwater resources. And so, coastal influence on the duck hunting side and goose hunting opportunities sort of hit or miss depending on where you are and what's in the surroundings in terms of food.
Brandon, I'll go to you now and ask you for a similar report. What are you hearing or what are you seeing? I don't know if y'all conduct any surveys, you can fill me in on that, but what are you hearing with regard to waterfowl numbers, sort of migration status, habitat conditions in your state?
Pretty similar to what Kyle talked about. So just like Washington, when you're talking about hunting success and kind of what the waterfowl population looks like throughout the winter, you really have to look at 2 different sides of the state, east and the west. So everything west of the Cascades is more lower elevation, predominantly wintering habitat. We do breed some birds, but it'd be something that you'd be looking like in the southern Mississippi Flyway, where, most of your birds are coming in from somewhere else for the winter. Whereas in eastern Oregon, there are some areas, lower elevation areas, that are wintering areas, specifically along the Columbia, but most of that habitat is higher elevation breeding habitat with some significant areas where a lot of birds will stage in the fall. So those areas, they're wrapping up for the season, seeing freezing temperatures, things like that. And then on the west side of the state, it's kind of, there's birds available for the whole season. We do not conduct any surveys throughout the season to assess abundance of migrants or wintering birds over time. We do have a couple of population level surveys where it's, we take one shot every winter to assess snow goose populations and a few things like that. The only exception to that would be in South Central Oregon at our Summer Lake Wildlife Area, a pretty large area that the department owns, where we do a weekly driving census. And again, though, that area is kind of wrapping up for the season. There's always some birds there, but instead of the 50, 60,000 ducks that we might estimate in early October, we're down to 5,000 or 6,000 that we're estimating now, and that's our typical overwintering number for that area. Overall, this year, things started out really well, especially in Western Oregon. Our barometer then becomes what we hear from hunters, maybe what we personally experience in the field, and then what we see at our state wildlife areas where we have check stations. So typically the one in Western Oregon we look at is Sauvie Island Wildlife Area outside of Portland. We had a fantastic start to the season there. Usually opening day is good. It was good, but then we continued that relatively high bird per hunter success all the way into early November. Then things kind of started to stagnate. We'd had some precipitation to fill some wetlands, but not a significant major rain events. And we just haven't had the cold temperatures, like Kyle said. We haven't had any prolonged below zero or below freezing events here in Western Oregon. And we typically don't get extremely cold where everything locks up for an extended period, but you do expect some icy mornings. We really haven't had any of that. So, most of the birds are likely here. That's just general migration chronology, but they're not being pressured. We finally had our first significant flood up rain event of the year just over the past weekend. I looked at the weather stations. Looks like we had, close to 3 inches of rain through a lot of the Willamette Valley, tons and tons of sheet water out there. I took a drive yesterday. And so, for the hunters that were able to respond to that, there's certainly some birds that are exploiting some new habitats. Whether or not they're new birds or not, that's debatable. But, when they're exploiting those new habitats, they certainly tend to act like new birds or are more predisposed to that. So there's probably some folks that had some success doing that. But on the flip side, if you're stuck in the same blind all the time and you went from having, that kind of really nice 1 foot to 18 inches of water to 3 feet of water, you probably lost all your puddle ducks. So that's kind of where we're at. Goose numbers continue to be strong. I know folks are doing pretty well here locally in Western Oregon, Northwestern Oregon on our cackling geese. And then seems to be a pretty good year for snow geese too at the areas where we do winter snow geese.
Awesome. Thank you for that report, Brandon. Let me ask you a bit of a follow-up question here. And I will say thank you for mentioning the habitat condition aspect of that, how there's some recent rain changed habitat conditions. Generally, it sounds for the better, unless it put too much water in some of those areas. Because I was trying to picture in my mind the type of habitats you had. Obviously, we talked about coastal tidal habitats. They're not going to be influenced as much by precipitation, obviously. But I was trying to frame up in my mind what other types of habitats you would have that would be able to take advantage of those variable weather conditions, and so. You covered that. So thank you for that. In terms of that weather, you mentioned it's sort of stale and you need some colder temperatures. Have either of you looked out in the forecast here over the next 7 to 10 days? Is there anything on the horizon? Are waterfowl hunters going to be given a Christmas present in terms of more favorable weather that you're seeing on the forecast?
Well, I'm not sure I'd call it a Christmas present, but I did take a look at the weather yesterday, and with this system that we got, it was a warm system. So our temperature yesterday was something like 55 degrees. So even though it was very ducky yesterday, spitting rain, sometimes very heavy rain at times, and quite windy all day long, the temp was warm. I think the extended forecast here is a change there where we're going to be cooler. I don't think we're talking any of those freezing type temperatures that really tend to make things a little bit better, but certainly, when your highs in the 40s and lows in the 30s are a lot better than highs, approaching 60 in December. So,
and Kyle, I guess the weather forecast that would be influencing issues there in Oregon, the important areas in those states are so close together that a weather forecast for Oregon is generally going to correspond to what you might see in Washington.
Yeah, pretty close. I mean, we both mentioned sort of this west-east divide of the Cascades. The basic underlying piece of that is the west side gets rain and water, and the east side is drier, certainly. And so it's one of those, keeping an eye on sort of rain and precip, as Brandon was describing, sort of flooding pastures and sort of river floodplains on the west side of the state. And on the east side of the state, it is definitely much more of that sort of tipping point of the cold, hard enough freeze that you're pushing birds into those sort of lower areas that actually still have some open water. And as he said, somewhere right around Christmas, it looks like what starts happening is a little bit more of a cold snap on the east side. And the other piece that he mentioned is, we're getting this sort of warm rain surge coming in from the ocean, but at the same time, we're having this sort of cold push from Alaska. And so in Washington, particularly on the west side, Puget Sound, sort of marine waters, that's where, you suddenly get this sort of swirl that might start happening, and kind of birds shifting around and in the local area. Whether or not that's really truly new birds coming in, or just birds that have been around that are having to suddenly figure out new areas, that's always part of the debate. But there's some change on the horizon, at least from the weather aspect.
Well, I can tell you that I don't think hunters are going to care very much whether they are new birds or whether they are birds that have been around and they're just finding their way into the decoys. As long as they find their way into the decoys, the hunters will be happy, right?
That's right.
That's true.
Let's see. I did a couple other things I did want to mention here before we wrap this up. Obviously, the Klamath Basin is a highly important area for waterfowl in Oregon, and we're not going to totally ignore that. I want our listeners here to be aware that later today, I have another session, an interview scheduled with John Radenberg, Fish and Wildlife Service employee down in the Klamath region. So we will have a special episode dedicated solely to an update on habitat and waterfowl conditions in the Klamath Basin. So I just want to make sure I worked that into this conversation here so people realize that we certainly are not overlooking that important area. Let's see. Final question, Brandon. I'm going to guess that these seasons are pretty similar, if not exactly the same, between your two states. So what are the seasons? How long do the duck seasons continue there in Oregon? And you can answer for Washington too, if you know that those are the same.
Yeah, so they pretty much are. Both our states, we have two zones, but those zones are very similar in their season timing. So our zone 2, which is kind of that high elevation area in eastern Oregon, it's going to continue through, I believe, the 24th of January this year. And then our zone 1, which is all of western Oregon, and then the eastern Oregon counties along the Columbia, which are low elevation wintering areas, that will continue through the 31st of January. So just a 1 week difference there. And our opening dates are also just have that 1 week difference. So, as many of the listeners may know, the Pacific Flyway is blessed with a longer duck season than a lot of the more eastern flyways, simply because, much lower numbers of hunters. So, we've got a 107-day season. And so we're looking for a duck season there to wrap up at the end of January, basically as late as you can go. And then our goose seasons, most of the goose seasons will close about the same time. But with some of the high migrant goose numbers we have, specifically cackling geese here in western Oregon, and then snow geese in several of the areas that we've already mentioned, we've got some later opportunities in just various parts of the state that'll go all the way through March 10 in some areas.
And Kyle, those dates capture the seasons in Washington as well? In
general, yeah. The dates change a little bit, but for duck season, as Brandon say, we take advantage of the full 107 in the Pacific Flyway. And so we run both of our zones for duck seasons in Washington act as one. So we run until the last Sunday, which this year is the 31st of January. And then and for goose season opportunities, it just depends on the zone. We have 5 different zones, and sort of it's a mix and match depending on what's sort of the focus. And so there are a couple areas that are open late for snow goose opportunity into February. And then there's an area that's open for cackling goose opportunity, like what Brandon was mentioning, trickling all the way into March in some cases.
Excellent. Guys, I appreciate your time and providing these very informative updates. I always learn a lot anytime I talk with our waterfowl biologists from states that I'm not familiar with, and Washington and Oregon certainly fall into that category. We've actually had a fair number of conversations about some issues in those two states, though, this year. So I feel like I'm actually gaining a bit of knowledge through this. So I appreciate that. And yeah, let's wrap this one up. And we will, as I said, we're going to have y'all back to discuss goose harvest management issues in your respective states. So thank you, guys.
You bet.
Thanks, Mike.
The special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Kyle Spriggans, Waterfowl Section Manager with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Brandon Reiches, the Migratory Game Bird Coordinator for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. We thank them for their time and the update from the field. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the work he does on editing and getting these podcasts out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and interest in the podcast and for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.